Hello everyone, welcome back. If you've already seen some of my other videos, if you're new here, I should let you know in advance that this video is going to be continuing the climb of a ladder of ideas, some of which might seem somewhat counterintuitive at first. So, if you haven't seen any of my other episodes in this series, then it might be a good idea to check out the playlist I have set up and watch some of my earlier videos on this subject. Be sure to like and subscribe, of course. I'm really just getting started here on YouTube, and if you're the kind of person who is interested in ideas which stray from the beaten path, then I think you'll like what I do here, because what I do here is I break down in rigorous detail concepts and theories which are very rarely addressed in a thorough manner, and which I think deserve much more serious attention. So, without any further ado, let's get into it. In the previous episodes of this series, we have looked at Rupert Sheldrake's theory of morphic resonance in a number of different ways. We've examined how the theory relates to the recent developments in developmental biology and embryology. We have looked at how the theory might be able to explain numerous types of phenomena which remain elusive to more orthodox explanations. And we have looked at how the theory can be situated within a process-relational understanding of nature. In this episode, we will begin to expand these ideas into even more bizarre and controversial territory, as we look at how morphic resonance might be able to account for so-called parapsychological phenomena in a naturalistic manner which does not attempt to simply dismiss or explain away such phenomena. In order to lay the groundwork for this discussion, I would like us to first return briefly to the ideas of Alfred North Whitehead, and examine how morphic resonance might be understood in terms of the system which Whitehead develops in his monumental Process and Reality. In doing so, we will see that within a framework such as the one developed by Whitehead, the concept of morphic resonance may seem to be not only possible, but entirely natural and perhaps even necessary. These ideas might seem rather abstract, but I think that they are actually rather intuitive once one gets a feel for the basic ideas, so bear with me. Within Process and Reality, Whitehead contends that the fundamental constituent elements of the world are self-organizing, symbiotic, and experiential processes. Whitehead's philosophical architecture can thus be described as a philosophical organicism. In his earlier work, Science and the Modern World, he would state, quote, "Biology is the study of the large organisms, whereas physics is the study of the small organisms," end quote. Within this model, the world consists most primarily of organic events, which are dipolar in their constitution. On the one hand, we have the objective pole, and on the other, a subjective pole. The objective pole of an organic event consists in the manner by which it inherits the physical reality around it. Events which have already occurred, and thus which have come to concretize into a definite structure, contribute themselves towards the determination of a novel event which is currently in process. This essentially amounts to a manner of describing what we would normally call physical causation. Due to the speed of light, events can only be physically influenced by events which have already happened. This physical influence is conditioned by relationships of geometric extension, or rather, space and time. Yet within Whitehead's system, this familiar mode of physical causation only accounts for half of the factors which give shape to self-organizational events. On the other side of this model, we have the subjective pole, in which a process actively realizes within itself certain patterns or possibilities which are available to it. Each process is characterized by a certain kind of unrest or tension or incoherence, which the process attempts to resolve or satisfy by self-organizing in accordance with certain patterns. At the biological level, we see this as the biological imperative of homeostasis. Organisms attempt to sustain and perpetuate themselves, and this requires that there be a certain balance or harmony of metabolic processes. When the organism is out of balance, perhaps because of a lack of food or because of an injury, the organism attempts to resolve this by eating or drinking or regenerating itself. There is a certain dynamic form which the organism wants to achieve and maintain, and thus the organism will act in such a way as to ensure that such form is actualized. We see such dynamics within the atomic realm as well. If an atom's valence electron is at a heightened energy state, this is a state of imbalance, which the atom will attempt to resolve by the emission of a photon. If an atom's valence shell can contain more electrons than the atom actually has, this is a kind of vacancy or incompleteness, which the atom will resolve by bonding with other atoms. At all levels of reality, we see a striving towards the actualization of a kind of dynamic equilibrium, and it is through such striving that chaotic multiplicities of processes come to symbiotically form themselves into complex wholes. The Chilean biologist Francisco Varela has famously dubbed this tendency as autopoiesis, or self-creation. The philosopher of science Donna Haraway has further developed this notion in coining the term sympoiesis, indicating that such processes are fundamentally symbiotic and mutualistic. Yet in this act of self-organization, an organic process is never fully determined by the physical inheritance of past events. The subjective pole of an organic event consists in a space of real potentialities which are available to it. The process itself, whether a molecule or a human being, ultimately determines for itself which possible patterns actually come to be realized within it. In other words, subjective agency is a fundamental aspect of organicity at all levels of the natural world. Organisms are always navigating through what we could call a phase space of real potentialities which are available to it. What I would like to suggest here is that these spaces of possibility are in fact the morphic fields which we have examined throughout this series. This implies that morphic fields are, in essence, the subjective pole of any organic process. It also implies that influences between morphic fields need not be mediated in the same way that physical influences are through spatial extension. Whitehead describes the physical influences of the past as physical prehensions. Conversely, he uses the term conceptual prehension to describe the relationship between a process and the possibilities which are available to it. But just as a process can be influenced by the physical dimension of a past event, so too it can be that an event is influenced by the subjective dimension of a past event. That is to say that the morphic field of a past event can contribute to shaping the morphic field of a subsequent event. Whitehead dubs this sort of influence hybrid prehension, in which the space of possibilities felt by an organic process in the past contributes itself to the shaping of the possibilities felt by an ongoing event. Such influence would thus be the kind of automatic averaging which Sheldrake describes in his theory of morphic resonance. The following quote is drawn from Whitehead's Process and Reality, and here we see Whitehead directly address this topic and its implications. This passage makes use of many technical terms which Whitehead develops over the course of the book, so this may seem rather obscure, but we will break this down as we move forward. Whitehead writes, quote, "A pure physical prehension is the transmission of physical feelings, while hybrid prehension is the transmission of mental feelings. There is no reason to assimilate the conditions for hybrid prehension to those for pure physical prehension. Indeed, the contrary hypothesis is the more natural. For the conceptual pole does not share in the coordinate divisibility of the physical pole. Thus, the doctrine of immediate objectification for the mental pole and of immediate objectification for the physical pole seems most consonant with the philosophy of organism. This conclusion has some empirical support, both from the evidence for peculiar instances of telepathy and from the instinctive apprehension of a tone of feeling in ordinary social intercourse. So, what Whitehead is saying here is that spatial extension is something which applies to physical relationships, but we have no reason to think that it should also apply to the relationships between mental poles, which consist of certain spaces of potentiality, which I am here identifying with what Sheldrake calls morphic fields. Thus, we should expect that such influences between morphic fields should occur in an immediate manner, as they needn't be mediated by relations of spatial extension. In other words, hybrid prehensions, or rather the influences of morphic resonance, should occur in a sort of telepathic manner. The morphic space which was navigated by an organic process may give shape to the spaces of possibility available to similar processes, without the need for physical interaction or physical proximity. Rather, as Sheldrake indicates, such fields of possibility influence one another on the basis of how similar they are to one another, rather than on the basis of whether or not they are spatially connected in any particular ways. Thus, if we look at the theory of morphic resonance through Whitehead's process-relational framework, rather than through the framework of mechanistic reductionism, we see that such a phenomena isn't particularly unusual, supernatural, or spooky at all, but rather is a natural extension of what we would expect from an organic, self-organizing world. There is no real need for some sort of extra medium to be at work here. We needn't necessarily hypothesize any hyperdimensional realm beyond what we can already see in the world around us. The Akashic field or aether simply is the totality of relationships found between living processes. There needn't be anything hidden behind nature as it already appears for us. So, let us now look at how this framework might allow us to understand certain kinds of purported parapsychological phenomena. What we find, Sheldrake argues, are influences between mental processes which are altogether natural rather than supernatural, and that we can understand such phenomena in a fully scientific manner. In our previous episode, we examined how the phenomenon of memory might be understood within the framework of morphic resonance. We can understand memory not as the storage of information about past events within the physical medium of the brain, in a manner analogous to computer memory, but rather as the reiteration within the brain of past experiences. As the brain's natural processes self-organize into an experiential state, these processes are guided along particular developmental pathways by the influence of the past experience itself. When successful, we relive the past experience. Though when we have had numerous experiences which are very similar, we find our memories to become less precise, as our process of reiteration can then be influenced by a multitude of past instances. But if a mind can be influenced by its own previous processes, it is then possible for a mind to be influenced by processes which have occurred within other minds. Sheldrake believes that such phenomena are not only possible, but in fact extremely common, although oftentimes very subtle under ordinary circumstances. Now, there is an enormous body of experimental research pertaining to so-called psi or psychic phenomena. Some psi research seems rather rigorous and compelling, while some attempts at such research seem much more dubious. This is a huge topic and realm of debate, and there's certainly no way that I can cover this topic exhaustively here. but I will point to some specific lines of research which seem to me to be the most rigorous and compelling. Yet before diving into this, I am going to have to get a bit polemical for a moment, as I'm sure that we are going to see some very predictable things happen in the comment section of this video, and I would like to attempt to address some of those things in advance. Parapsychology is a controversial topic. This is a topic upon which reasonable people might disagree. If you do not find any of the research discussed here to be indicative of non-local influence between mental processes, then you are perfectly entitled to believe that such phenomena do not occur. With that said, there are several individuals, such as Michael Shermer, James Randi, and Susan Blackmore, who have essentially built their entire careers upon the claim that parapsychologists themselves are essentially all a bunch of quacks or charlatans who don't understand how science works. Such so-called skeptics and the people who cite them tend to employ tactics which are, in my opinion, very dishonest, to put it mildly. These people have absolutely no reservations about hurling ad hominem attacks and are very clear that their own methodology involves making assumptions about what cannot be the case and then forming arguments for the sole purpose of dismissing any evidence that those assumptions might be incorrect. I myself was once of that persuasion. I read Shermer, Blackmore, and Randi's books, and I was confident that there simply were no real psi phenomena because I only ever encountered psi research through the lens which such skeptics provided. It was very easy for me to be dismissive of such ideas even though I knew essentially nothing about actual psi research, because that attitude of dismissal is exactly what those professional skeptics strive to instill in their readers. They do not want people to evaluate psi research and then come to the conclusion that it is all faulty. They want people to conclude that actually conducting such critical evaluation would be a waste of time. Eventually, I changed my mind, not because of an experimental bombshell that I could not dismiss, but rather because my philosophical conceptions about nature itself changed over time. Once I came to the conclusion that psi phenomena might be at least possible, then I took the time to actually look into psi research itself, and ultimately I concluded that certain kinds of psi phenomena are probably real. I don't believe that every self-proclaimed medium or psychic is in possession of magical powers. Some people really are charlatans, and we should be mindful of that. But it is my opinion that extrasensory influences between minds may actually be a rather common occurrence, which operates on the same basis as memory. Professional skeptics proclaim to know what reality must be like in advance, and their agenda is to attack, ridicule, and dismiss those who disagree in whatever ways seem convenient for them. Such skepticism is a project of swaying public opinion by use of rhetoric, not a scientific pursuit of truth. Their agenda is ideological and thus political, not scientific. It is their goal to promulgate a particular idea. That idea is not simply the claim that psi phenomena lack sufficient evidence, but rather it is the idea that people who conduct psi research, or who take the possibility of psi phenomena seriously, are quacks and charlatans who should not be listened to or taken seriously at all. Yet among those who have taken psi phenomena seriously are esteemed intellectual figures such as William James, Alfred North Whitehead, Jean Gebser, Henri Bergson, Thomas Campbell, and of course Rupert Sheldrake. If you do not think that parapsychological phenomena are genuine, then there are legitimate reasons why you might think that is the case, and reasonable discussions can be had on this topic. However, if you simply want to insinuate that only simple-minded and gullible people believe such things, then I would advise you to consider the names I listed above and maybe take some time to actually evaluate some of the research rather than forming opinions in advance and then looking for confirmation of what you already believe. The universe is a very strange place, and nature has no obligation whatsoever to conform to our ideas of what a tidy, logical, and rational world should look like. This is a topic which we will be returning to later, as I plan to do at least a couple of videos addressing the philosophy of science and how our perception of what is possible comes to be shaped by what we imagine science to be, even if those conceptions have little to do with what science actually is. So to begin with, let us look at some of the experiments which have been conducted by Sheldrake himself and others, which may be indicative of extrasensory influences between minds. Then we will look at how we might explain such phenomena in light of morphic resonance theory. I will not here be elaborating on every single detail and data point of these experiments because I don't want this to be an excruciatingly long video, but links to more detailed overviews of these experiments will be found in the description box below. And I very much encourage you to take a look at the original research, as I think the finer details of these experiments shows them to be even more compelling. One type of research that Sheldrake has conducted pertains to the seeming tendency for individuals to intuit a phone call before it happens. It's extremely common for people to feel that they think about a person close to them just before that person calls them, or that they feel themselves to accurately sense who is calling them before they actually look at their phones. Sheldrake has taken anecdotes such as these as being a clue which could be indicative of extrasensory phenomena related to morphic resonance, and he has developed experiments to determine whether such intuitions do actually indicate real phenomena. In Sheldrake's telephone telepathy experiments, conducted in the early 2000s, his team began by recruiting participants who were then instructed to nominate 4 potential callers who they personally knew. Experimenters would randomly determine which of the 4 callers would be calling the test subject, and then let the nominee know that they would be the one making the call. They would also then call the other nominees to let them know that they had not been selected to participate. Then, before the phone call was made by the nominee, the experimenters would call the recipient and ask them to guess which of the 4 nominees would be calling them. This guess would be noted, and shortly thereafter, the selected caller would call the recipient. This first round of tests involved 17 subject recipients and conducted 198 trials in total. In a second series of trials, Sheldrake and his team began using fixed times for the calls rather than randomly selecting the call times. These methods were used for a total of 87 trials. In a third series of trials, the research team streamlined the process such that selected callers would know that they had been selected 15 minutes in advance of the call, and that nominees who had not been selected would know that they would not participate by 5 minutes in advance of the call. Using these methods, the researchers involved 34 participants over the course of 268 trials. Sheldrake hypothesized that since the call recipient subjects likely knew all of their nominees personally, it would thus be likely that certain patterns of activity within the call recipients' minds might respond to similar patterns which could occur within the minds of the selected callers when the callers thought about making the call. Thus, it would be possible that the recipient would be able to use this unconscious activity to intuitively determine which nominee would actually be calling them, as there would be a sort of synchronization between minds which might be activated by the intent to make the call. Human beings are, of course, inextricably social creatures, and if such synchronizations are indeed possible due to the effects of morphic resonance, then it seems likely that evolution would give rise to processes by which such interactions could occur, as such synchronizations could be very helpful for survival in numerous ways if such connections could come to link different members of families or social groups. If the guesses made by the recipients were due to random chance, then we would expect them to guess correctly about 25% of the time on average. During the first 30 trials, Sheldrake's team found that the guesses made by the recipients were correct 43% of the time. In the next series of 146 trials, the participants guessed correctly in 40% of the trials. This result was extremely significant statistically, yielding a p-value of 0.00003, one which is many times lower and thus more statistically significant than the common standard p-value of 0.05, above which results are considered to be statistically insignificant. In other words, a p-value of 0.05 indicates a 5% probability that the results could have came about by sheer random chance, while the p-value of 0.00003 is a 0.003% chance, or 3 in 100,000. In the next series of 232 trials, the guesses of participants were correct 98 times, or in 42% of the trials. The p-value of this series was 7 by 10 to the negative 9, an extremely high statistical significance. These trials also distinguished between results obtained in which the caller was familiar to the recipient and in which the caller did not personally know the recipient. In trials involving the caller who knew the recipients were correct 54% of the time, while in trials involving a caller who was a stranger, the recipients were correct 24% of the time. This yielded a total of 42%. These results accorded with Sheldrake's prediction that more familiar callers would yield greater results, as connections between the minds of the callers and recipients would be more developed or pronounced. Whatever the explanation might be for these phenomena, random chance would be an absurdly improbable explanation, and an alternative explanation would need to account for why the recipients' guesses were so much more accurate when they knew the person who was about to call them. Sheldrake also took note of how many people's pets, particularly dogs, seem to be waiting for them when they come home from a period of absence. Dogs will often sit at a window or the front door and patiently wait for their owner to return. This is a phenomenon which could very easily be explained by numerous mundane factors. The dog might be familiar with what times the owner tends to return, or they might infer that the owner is returning based on the sound of the owner's car, or even the owner's scent. Nevertheless, Sheldrake suspected that this phenomenon might very well prove to be another example of synchronization between minds which occurred due to morphic resonance, and thus sought to construct experiments in which this possibility could be tested. Within these experiments, Sheldrake set up cameras which could record the times which dogs spent near the front windows where they tended to await their owner's return. Subjects would drive cars other than their own and return home at random times as directed by a telephone pager. After being paged, the subjects would then allow a 10-minute pre-return period to elapse before beginning the return home. The recorded video footage would then be analyzed by a person who was not aware of when the subjects had been paged to return home, or any other details of the experiment. The analyst would take note of the times spent by the dog at the window, and these results would then be compared with the absence, pre-return, and return periods. What this research discovered was that the tested dog spent much more time at the window anticipating the owner's return during the pre-return and return periods than main periods of absence. Following the paging of the subject, the dogs would begin spending significantly more time waiting at the window than before the page, even if the dog's owner remained several kilometers away. One remaining possibility was that the dogs were much more likely to spend time at the window during the pre-return and return periods simply because the dogs understood that the owner would be more likely to come home as time went on. In order to test for this, the researchers also recorded the dog's behavior in trials within which the owner did not come home at all. If the dogs were simply being statistically predictive of their owner's behaviors, then we would expect to see the dogs spend much more time at the window over the course of the day as their anticipation of the return increased, even though the owner would not in fact be returning that day. The results instead showed that the dog's behavior remained consistent throughout the entire course of the experiment. The dogs would occasionally go near the window for one reason or another, but this behavior was distributed evenly throughout the entire course of the experiment. Beyond Sheldrake's own research, there is also an extensive body of parapsychological experimentation which has been conducted over the course of the 20th and 21st centuries. Although even positive results often appear to be small, these experiments nonetheless seem to indicate, among other things, that the minds of human beings are indeed capable of tuning into one another without direct sensory interaction. One form of experiments involves recruiting pairs of subjects who have personal connections with one another. The individuals of each pair are separated and their brain activity is then measured using electroencephalography. One subject of the pair is designated as the sender and the other as the receiver. The sender is then randomly exposed to certain stimuli, such as flashing images on a television screen, and experimenters then go on to compare the EEG data to determine whether statistically significant correlations seem to have occurred between the two subjects. Numerous variations of this experiment have been conducted. Some, for example, involve isolating the subjects within electromagnetically shielded rooms. Nevertheless, results appear to show a very consistent pattern. With most of the pairs of subjects, correlations between EEG readings appears to be statistically unimpressive. Yet for certain pairs of subjects, correlations are consistently above what would be expected by random chance. In an iteration of this experiment conducted by Dr. Dean Radin, published in 2004, researchers found that 3 out of 13 tested pairs demonstrated independently significant correlations, and also found that stronger EEG responses in stimulated subjects correlated with stronger synchronized responses in their non-stimulated correlates. Overall, the experiment yielded a p-value of 0.0005, compared to a control group p-value of 0.61. In another such series of experiments, also conducted in 2004, another team of researchers similarly found that 5 out of 60 experimental subjects who had not received stimuli demonstrated highly significant correlations to the stimuli responses recorded in their counterparts. As with Dr. Radin's experiments, the correlations found were far beyond what can be explained by random chance, while results remained statistically insignificant during periods in which the sender was not exposed to visual stimuli. For the pairs which showed correlations with a p-value of less than 0.01, the average p-value came out to be 0.0005, far beyond the realm of mere chance. As the researchers concluded, quote, "These data support the findings of similar studies performed in 7 laboratories reported in peer-reviewed literature since 1963. In other words, this phenomena has been consistently observed experimentally throughout numerous studies over the course of several decades, all of which indicate some kind of extrasensory interaction between the brain states of certain pairs of experimental subjects." In 2018, a study by Professor Etzel Cardano was published by the journal American Psychologist, in which over 750 discrete studies of parapsychological phenomena were analyzed. The article concluded that evidence in favor of psi was, quote, "comparable to that for established phenomena in psychology and other disciplines." That is to say that we have as much experimental evidence to back up the reality of psi phenomena as we have to back up many of the claims which are generally accepted within established academic psychology. Although the existence of psi phenomena is highly controversial among academics, it is worth noting that most academic skepticism towards psi phenomena is rooted in preconceptions about how nature operates, not in well-grounded reasons for believing that such phenomena are not possible. With the general public, however, almost the exact opposite situation is found. Published surveys have shown that around 60% of people living in the United States believe in some form of psi phenomena. Although skeptics might claim that such beliefs are due to the fact that the general public is more likely to be duped due to being less educated, it should be noted that academics themselves are duped on a fairly regular basis, either as a result of fraud, mistakes, or intentional hoaxes, even within peer-reviewed journals. It is, however, specifically within the halls of academia where students are encouraged to believe that science has already discovered the fundamental nature of the world, and thus that certain things simply cannot be real. Ordinary people lacking such a paradigmatic affinity see no reason not to trust their own personal experiences. There is a vast body of experimental research which purports to demonstrate evidence for extrasensory interaction between human minds, and adequately addressing the relevant literature, rebuttals, and counter-rebuttals would be a massive project in and of itself. Yet here I intend primarily to refer to this data as potential evidence for morphic resonance. One very common and dubious criticism of psi research is that it lacks an explanatory mechanism. This criticism essentially amounts to saying that because we don't know how psi phenomena could be possible, psi phenomena must therefore not be possible, even if experimental evidence indicates otherwise. In reality, there are several proposed explanatory mechanisms for such psi phenomena, but morphic resonance is a cohesive theory with implications which extend far beyond the bounds of human psychology, and thus it is a theory which can be corroborated by other types of experiments and observations, some of which we have already examined in earlier videos of this series. Although certainly not all psi research is convincing, that is also true for much of the research conducted in all other fields of science. Sometimes criticisms of psi research are valid and constructive, yet those who attempt to dismiss, ridicule, or debunk all psi research on a matter of principle tend to be forced to contrive exceedingly unlikely explanations in order to account for the data psi researchers have produced. Oftentimes, the more concise and likely explanation seems to be that psi phenomena simply do occur, and we should ask ourselves what sort of processes might actually account for these phenomena. With morphic resonance, we have an explanation which seems able not only to account for psi phenomena in general, but which is also able to explain many of the specific nuances of psi phenomena which researchers have demonstrated. The theory does not need to fall back on vaguely defined possibilities within the realm of particle physics in order to seem plausible. Morphic resonance is instead, I would argue, a theory which synergizes with and is even implicated by various other significant and rigorous ideas such as those of emergent causation, bioelectricity, process philosophy, and the emerging field of quantum biology. From what we have examined thus far, it seems we can plausibly conclude that human minds, and perhaps even minds in general, are able to interact with one another in non-local ways, which needn't be mediated by sensory interactions between bodies. This connects minds across both space and time, and it is through these kinds of influence that past mental activities are able to continually shape the present. As we expand our scope from interactions between specific minds to minds in general, what comes into focus is what we might call a collective consciousness. Carl Jung writes, quote, "In dreams, fantasies, and other exceptional states of mind, the most far-fetched mythological motifs and symbols can appear autochthonously at any time, often apparently as the result of particular influences, traditions, and excitations working on the individual, but more often without any sign of them. These primordial images, or archetypes as I have called them, belong to the basic stock of the unconscious psyche and cannot be explained as personal acquisitions. Together they make up that psychic stratum which has been called the collective unconscious. Carl Jung did not believe that these common psychological motifs could be explained merely as artifacts of cultural transmission, as he clearly states that oftentimes there is a conspicuous lack of evidence for such a mode of transmission. Jung instead maintains that these archetypes must be understood as personalities which dwell within a fundamentally transpersonal, collective realm of the human psyche. As for how this collective psyche might come to influence an individual psyche without direct transmission, Jung remained mostly agnostic. Nevertheless, we can clearly see that this presents us with a problem, and one which I believe morphic resonance might help us to solve. Of course, it could be argued that the collective unconscious might be explained as something which is transmitted by the human genome. Yet we have already examined previously why that would be an immense overestimation of the actual power of the information found in DNA. To reiterate, DNA provides cells with the basic toolkits of proteins with which it is able to operate. But DNA does not encode the morphological information which actually shapes the organism as a whole. As such, it seems immensely unlikely that a complex web of primordial images, narrative motifs, mythological associations, and archetypal personalities could simply be contained within sequences of DNA. In case studies detailed in his book, The Cosmic Game, Czech psychiatrist Stanislav Grof recounts experiments with altered states of consciousness, which he refers to as holotropic states. Within this research, subjects often reported highly detailed experiences of figures which Grof noted as strikingly similar to mythical and religious figures from cultures which the experimental subjects were themselves not familiar with. In one such instance, one of Grof's clinical patients had gone through a psychedelic therapy session in which the patient, who Grof refers to as Otto, stated that he had experienced vivid visions of a terrifying, pig-like goddess who guarded the entrance to the underworld. Otto had suffered from chronic death anxiety, and this experience seemed to be one in which he was brought into confrontation with this primordial fear. As the experience culminated, the patient opened his eyes and urgently asked Grof to bring him paper and writing utensils. Otto then began to sketch out elaborate geometrical patterns on the paper. Repeatedly, Otto would come to crumble up the paper and begin again on another sheet as he felt an urgent need to, quote, get it right. Grof himself was baffled by the nature of this experience until Grof came to recount the events to his colleague, the mythologist Joseph Campbell. Campbell would identify the pig-like goddess as a mother goddess of night and death found within the Malakulan culture of New Guinea. Grof explains, quote, the Malakulans had an elaborate system of rituals that involved breeding and sacrificing pigs. This complex ritual activity was aimed at overcoming the dependency on their human mothers and eventually on the devouring mother goddess. The Malakulans spent an enormous amount of time practicing the art of the labyrinth drawing, since its mastery was considered essential for a successful journey to the beyond. End quote. Through the lens of mechanistic thinking, such anomalies seem ridiculous. How could a person experience visions of mythological or religious imagery which the person has never personally encountered before? Although such mechanistic presumptions might incline us to write off these details as simply being strange coincidences, morphic resonance theory might instead indicate that these bizarre correspondences are instead the natural results of the fact that all human minds are, on some level and to some degree, interwoven with one another within a very much substantial collective unconscious, just as Carl Jung had observed in his own research. Another provocative and bizarre phenomena which may be indicative of morphic resonance comes from the realm of anthropology and ethnobotany. In his book, Sappho in My Soul, investigative journalist Peter Gorman recounts his experiences with the Matzes people of the Peruvian and Brazilian Amazon rainforest. Gorman, accompanied by his guide Moises Torres Viena, a specialist in jungle survival, sought to study and experience certain mind-altering medicinal substances used by the Matzes people known as Sappho and Nunu. While Sappho, also known as Cambo, is a substance used in traditional cleansing rituals, which often result in nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, and increased heart rate, Nunu is instead used as a kind of quasi-psychedelic stimulant used for hunting animals. Practitioners are said to use the substance Nunu in order to induce clairvoyant visions of animals within the forest, and to use these visions to track down or ambush prey. Within Sappho in My Soul, Gorman recounts his first experience with the strange snuff-like substance, and the seemingly inexplicable experiences which followed. Quote, "I closed my eyes. Out of the blackness I began to have visions of animals, tapirs, monkeys, wild boar, that I saw more clearly than my limited experience with them should have allowed. Suddenly, unexpectedly, a group of boars stampeded in front of me. As I watched them thunder through my field of vision, several began to fall. Moments later the visions faded, and a pleasant sense of drunkenness washed over me. Moises asked me what I'd seen and whether I recognized the place where the vision happened. I told him it looked like the place where we'd eaten lunch earlier in the day. He asked what time it was in the vision, and I told him that the sun was shining, but mist still shrouded the trees. He put the time between 7 and 8 a.m. Despite my suspicion that I'd invented the entire vision, Moises told the Matzes what I'd seen. Gorman goes on to recount that he and the Matzes then traveled to the location he believed he had seen within his vision at dawn the next morning. To his surprise, they did indeed find a pack of wild boars, several of which the Matzes were able to successfully slay. Gorman goes on to conclude, quote, "Improbable as it seemed, the scene was close enough to what I described that there was no denying the veracity of the vision. I later asked how Nunu worked. Pablo explained in a mix of hand signals, Matzes, and Pidgin Spanish, which he'd learned from the occasional missionaries and river traders who came to the camp, that Nunu put you in touch with the animals. He said the animals' spirits also see the visions and know what awaits them. He spoke as though I were a slow child, with everyone but my brother-in-law and me already knowing what he was saying. For my part, I'll never understand how Nunu works, but I've witnessed the success of its visions so frequently that I don't question what's seen in them." End quote. Strange, anomalous phenomena and experiences such as those we've examined in this video are, overall, actually quite ubiquitous. Although it may be possible to explain any one of these strange cases individually in a way that involves only mechanistic causation, when one attempts to apply such explanation to the whole of such accounts, it begins to become rather clear that explaining away such phenomena would require far more elaborate and improbable mental gymnastics than simply attempting to actually explain them as legitimate phenomena. Regarding the reported effects of Nunu, it seems to me most likely that the substance may act by dissociating certain mental processes within the mind of practitioners from their sensory orientation towards their imminent physical surroundings. No longer conditioned primarily by these immediate sensory stimuli, these mental processes are then able to act as something like a radio antenna, which is shaped by influences of mental processes happening in nearby animals. Through morphic resonance, the person is able to tune into the experiences being had by these animals and use this reception to then determine where the animals are. This explanation would also accord with the sense of pleasant drunkenness which Gorman recounted, and this could be a sort of anesthetic effect which results from the disconnection of mind from imminent sensory information. In Process and Reality, Whitehead says the following with regards to the telepathic influences which he had theorized. Quote, "Of course, such immediate objectification, that is, hybrid or telepathic influence, is also reinforced or weakened by mediate objectification, that is, sensory or bodily influences. It will only be in exceptional circumstances that an immediate hybrid prehension has sufficiently vivid definition to receive a subjective form of clear, conscious attention." End quote. In other words, although such telepathic influences might constantly be at work, it is only under exceptional circumstances that such influences might be disentangled from other cognitive processes at work within our minds. Perhaps substances such as nu-nu are used specifically due to their capacity to induce such exceptional circumstances. However, we must also note that Gorman's experience seemed to be one in which he experienced where this pack of wild boars would be the next morning, not where they presently were. We might explain this by saying that Gorman was experiencing the animal's own experience of their intentions rather than their immediate situation. He was receiving what the animals planned to do rather than what they were actively doing. Yet this nuance might also be suggestive of an even more speculative explanation. Within Morphic Resonance, the nature of formative causation, Sheldrake addresses the possibility that Morphic Resonance might somehow be able to act retroactively, that future events might be able to influence events in the present. Sheldrake acknowledges this possibility, but sets it aside in an effort not to unnecessarily complicate the hypothesis. It does seem somewhat outlandish that the future could influence the past, as future events have, by definition, not yet occurred. But upon further examination, I think we might find that this possibility isn't as ridiculous as it might first seem. In a sense, future events shape the present all the time. In ordinary life, we are constantly imagining scenarios and then taking the steps needed to actualize them. Whenever we strive to bring about a certain possibility, it could be said that a certain structure of as yet unrealized potentiality is giving shape to the present. Although I do not think that the future is so determined in advance that it is in effect already set in stone, I think it might be possible that certain future events are so overdetermined by the present that they are, in a sense, already actual, and thus perhaps able to influence our present experiences through a kind of retroactive morphic resonance. In a study published in 2003 in the Journal for the Scientific Study of Religion, researchers found that just under half of participants reported having had experiences of knowing something about the future in a seemingly precognitive manner, and over 40% reported experiencing dreams, which seemed to provide information about events which had yet to occur. Although precognition might at first seem fantastical, it may very well be that the precognitive experiences induced by substances such as nu-nu might very well be more accentuated instances of processes which are actually at work in ordinary human life on a regular basis, but which mostly lie beneath the surface of our ordinary sensory awareness. There may certainly be other theories which might explain psi phenomena, or the seemingly clairvoyant effects of Nunu in a cohesive and satisfactory manner. To my knowledge, however, the best candidate for actually explaining such things is, of course, Rupert Sheldrake's theory of morphic resonance. If organic systems such as living bodies and minds can and do indeed influence one another in the manner that Sheldrake supposes, then many of these phenomena, though undoubtedly amazing, do not seem supernatural or paranormal, but rather simply natural and normal. They appear to us as phenomena which many of us perhaps have intuitively understood already, but which have been largely excluded or ignored within the paradigm of mechanistic materialism, which remains dominant within most academic institutions. An idea like morphic resonance is undoubtedly a big ask. It surely seems to many as fanciful, pseudo-scientific, or even superstitious in nature. However, it has been my goal throughout the course of this series to indicate that this theory may indeed be quite credible, perhaps even more so than many of the claims which are made by established scientists with extreme confidence, which in fact often prove to rest on exceptionally tenuous foundations. Institutional science may not be prepared to take seriously, let alone accept, ideas like morphic resonance, but I believe that this resistance stems much more from the nature of the established scientific paradigm of materialism and reductionism than it is a matter of genuine plausibility, explanatory power, or evidence. Yet this is something which I am far from pessimistic about, as the established paradigm of reductionist materialism is one which is itself in a state of crisis, which has only continued to become more and more acute over the course of the last century, and which continues to falter as we move further into the 21st century. This is not to say that we should be dismissive of science itself, or of the scientific enterprise in general, but rather the suggestion I am making here, which has been made by so many other thinkers throughout the history of science, is that the paradigm now solidified within scientific institutions may in many ways rest upon presumptions which are in desperate need of re-examination. Advances in biology continue to fracture the selfish gene model of evolutionary theory. Advances in psi research continue to become more and more difficult to dismiss or explain away. New observations made by technologies such as the James Webb Space Telescope continue to show that standard cosmology is simply unable to accord with the world which we actually find ourselves within. As these issues continue to compound, this crisis within scientific paradigms will culminate in a gradual yet monumental revolution within scientific thinking, one which I believe will result in a much overdue transition from a mechanistic cosmology to an organic cosmology, as thinkers such as Bergson, Whitehead, Sheldrake, and many others have envisioned for well over a century. Moving forward, I want to expand these ideas into the realm of cosmology at large and begin bringing divergent astrophysical ideas into this conversation. We will come to look at alternatives to standard mechanistic cosmology such as the electric universe theory and plasma universe theory, and look at how ideas from these frameworks might lend themselves to an understanding of the cosmos as a truly living tapestry of morphogenetic processes, rather than a dead explosion in slow motion on its way to an inevitable, entropic, and meaningless end. As always, thank you all so much for your time and patience. Your comments are always fantastic, and the motivation they bring to me is utterly fantastic. Please like and subscribe if you haven't already. I really want this channel to be a wild and mind-bending ride for everyone, and of course, the more the merrier. Once again, and until next time, thank you.